past few years, we've through Hank, we've sponsored summer interns to come together and work on various aspects of the overall campaign. We've focused in the past on carbon. One year we had interns work on that. We've focused on some fire disturbance issues, and then this year we had two students working on some of the airborne data sets. We have three students total, and two of them are going to present today, and one of them will present a little bit later in the summer when her internship finishes up. So today we're going to hear from both Miles Moore and Michael Howerton, and I think Michael's going to start us off. And so, Michael, if you want to go ahead and take it away, make sure you can say a little bit about where you're coming from, and then go ahead.
Okay. All right. So hopefully everyone can see my slides. Well, hello and welcome to my talk entitled Elvis Bruce Lee Using LiDAR to Investigate Boreal Change. So my name is Michael Howerton. I just graduated from the University of Maryland, College Park, with a degree in environmental science. And coming up in the fall, I'm going to be starting my work towards a master's in geographical sciences, also at U of E College Park, under my grad advisor, George Hurt. And so I'll tell you a little bit about what I've done this summer. My mentor has been Dr. Liz Hoy, and I've been supported by Libby Larson and Paul Montesano. So my internship was done mainly in three parts. The first, which was exploring Elvis. So what data do we have available? Where is that data concentrated? And taking a look at the breadth of observation throughout the two Elvis missions under ABoVE. Next, I compared that to ISAT-2 and took a small portion of ISAT-2 data to see where we have coincident observation between Elvis and ISAT-2 in order to sort of inform analysis between the two. And lastly, I updated the ABoVE website, specifically the sites and measurements. I used field plans and calendar entries to reach out to investigators of field missions and entered new missions to the website, updated old ones, and validated whether some field plans were carried out altogether. And tying it together, the through line is what data has ABoVE produced, what does it have access to, and how can this inform science moving forward? So hopefully my updates, especially to the ABoVE planning tool, tie these together in a way that's usable to you all after I'm done being an intern. So starting with the first part, what is Elvis? It's the land, vegetation, and ice sensor. It's an airborne instrument with a high altitude, medium footprint that uses waveform digitizing LiDAR. It measures surface topography and topographic extent, like canopy height, crevice depth, etc. And its high sensitivity waveforms can see through dense canopies, and so it's good at looking at forests. Summed up, it's a wide swath laser altimeter system. And so Elvis has flown two missions within the ABoVE domain, one in 2017 and one in 2019, which I'll get into a little further. But that's not Elvis's only use. It's been used since the 90s, collecting observations in Africa, Antarctica, Central and South America, Greenland, as well as North America. So what data has been collected by Elvis? First, I want to clarify my study area. I've only been looking at the ABoVE domain, so going from Alaska to the Canadian Arctic archipelago down to Manitoba and British Columbia. Flights for Elvis did leave from the continental US, so the sensor did collect some data outside of the ABoVE domain, but my summary is only going to be about the data within the ABoVE domain. And speaking of summary, we had several flights flown over diverse science targets based out of multiple airports in Canada and Alaska, which summed up to, between the 2 years, over 88,000 kilometers flown and over 90,000 square kilometers of area imaged. And so for these over 90,000 square kilometers, we have two data products available. The level 1B data contains the geolocated laser waveform data for each footprint, which is sort of the raw output. And level 2 contains canopy top and ground elevations, as well as relative heights. And all of these are derived from the raw level 1B data. Now, breaking it down a little further, Like I said, 2 missions, one in 2017 and one in 2019. And I can break down the difference a little bit. So slightly different times of year. The 2017 one was looking at June, July versus July, August in the second mission. And from the map, it's pretty evident. On the left, the red, we're looking at 2017 versus blue is the 2019 flight paths. And so we had a lot more flights going a lot further in 2019. That's 65,000 kilometers versus 17,000 kilometers in 2017. Also, a different plane carried the sensor each year. So 2017, it was flying lower to the ground at about 28,000 feet versus 41,000 feet in 2019. And this affects the swath width as well of the data that was produced. So we have a smaller swath in 2017 of 1.8 kilometers versus 2.5 kilometer swath in 2019. And so the last difference I'll note is the area imaged. Obviously, we're seeing a lot more area imaged in 2019. That's 75,000 square kilometers versus 17,000 in 2017. And despite these differences, the same data products are available between the missions. And so whether data was collected in this first mission or in the second, you're still going to see that level 1B and the level 2 data available for each. So now I want to show the types of areas that Elvis observed. I used a number of existing delineations to look at this, the first being EPA ecoregions. And so level 1 breaks North America down into 15 regions, and EPA describes this level 1 as good for global or intercontinental comparison. And so out of the 7 ecoregions of level 1 that are within the above domain, Elvis sensed 6 of them. And most noteworthy when I'm looking at this chart is taiga, which represents over 50% of the observation for both years. So I wanted to break it down a little further. If so much of this is taiga, what areas of taiga does Elvis have the most observation on? And so I looked at EPA level 2 ecoregions, which are more specific, breaks North America down into 50 regions. And these are described as good for subcontinental overviews. Here, Elvis recorded data of 12 out of the 16 regions within the above domain. And looking at the chart, the big winners here are Taiga Plain and Arctic Boreal Interior, each comprising about a quarter of the observation total between both years. And so also notable here is that the majority of the tundra which was sensed came from Alaska tundra. We have these two tundra regions, and it's about 3-to-1 of this Alaska tundra, which is in the bluish purple, pinkish purple, as opposed to the Brooks Range tundra. And so I got a little further into the nitty-gritty of analyzing even smaller delineations, just sort of in order to display the diversity of areas sensed. And so EPA level 3, designed for regional planning, Elvis covers 33 of these ecoregions. World Wildlife Fund is a global data set, and so it could perhaps have different applications in terms of comparing to the rest of the world. In those ecoregions, Elvis covered 16 regions here. And finally, this data on the right represents hydro basins within boreal, tundra, and tundra taiga ecotone regions. These are separated out by watershed. And within this area, which doesn't even cover the full above domain, doesn't go as far north or far south, Elvis intersects 1,700 basins. And so hopefully this slide just shows you the diversity of the areas sensed. Now, part of my title for this presentation is using LiDAR to investigate boreal change, but I want to clarify that Elvis goes beyond boreal. So this figure shows Elvis coverage of tundra in blue. And so overall, we have a ratio of about 6-to-1 non-tundra to tundra observation. And part of that is 26 areas of intersection at the edge of tundra and taiga, which could be useful in researching ecotones as well. Overall, I showed you all these breakdowns to illustrate the abundance of possible applications of Elvis data. It's great for boreal forest, but it also contains robust observation of tundra, ecotones, and beyond. Now I'm moving beyond Elvis itself to look at other data sets that can be used in conjunction with it. So let's take a look at ISAT-2. So what is ISAT-2? It's the successor to ICESat, which collected data from 2003 to 2009. ICESat-2 is a NASA satellite observing the planet since 2018, October 2018. Follows a polar orbit and repeats ground tracks in polar regions every 91 days. And it carries just one instrument called Atlas. This uses 6 lasers to take frequent, precise measurements of elevation, whether that be ice, land, water, or important when comparing to Elvis, vegetation. It sends 10,000 pulses per second, which translates to a measurement every 2.3 feet along ICESat's ground path. And so that's what this image is sort of showing, the difference between ICESat on the left and ICESat-2 on the right. ICESat-2 providing much denser coverage of Earth's surface. And so this dense coverage translates to an immense amount of data. It's 1 terabyte coming from ICESat-2 every single day since the end of 2018. And so how does this relate to Elvis? They both produce actively sensed elevation data. And so we can look at ground elevation, canopy height, relative height, and compare those. And so here I have a visualization of coincident data using just a small sample from ICESat-2. And so the sample I have from ICESat-2 is just looking at this 4-month period from June to September 2020. And just in those 4 months of ICESat-2 observation, we had 44,000 coincident observations between Elvis and ICESat-2. And this map is showing you all of those observations, and the difference between the gray and the black points is just showing you the spatial correlation. I just wanted to illustrate that all of the black points represent 34,000 of the 44,000. And so these were detected as clusters and have a denser observation of both Elvis and ICESat-2. And so if we were to be using both Elvis and ICESat, the area around Fairbanks and throughout the Northwest Territories has an abundance of dense observation for both. So all in all, ICESat-2 is definitely a terrific source to be used in conjunction with Elvis. And so the third part of my internship has been updating the sites and measurements. So now I'll update you on how I did updating the website. As I'm sure you're aware, the ABoVE planning tool logs all ABoVE affiliated field missions. So this image is showing you every mission that's currently on the ABoVE planning tool. So it's an asset in planning future science. Where does ABoVE already have data? Where should it go next? My job has been to reach out to many of the investigators within ABoVE in order to get this tool as up to date as possible. So in doing so, I used field plan documents and calendar entries to reach out to investigators of field missions. Specifically, I was provided with the calendars for the Fairbanks Equipment Office and the Canada ABoVE Resources calendar, as well as field plan spreadsheets from 2021, 22, and 23. And so with all of those, I reached out to 48 investigators who worked on 71 field missions going back to 2020. And I entered the new missions into the website, as well as I updated old ones. So sometimes people had sent me an updated KML or wanted to include a measurement that wasn't initially in their first entry. And then because, like I said, I was using field plan documents, I validated whether some plans were carried out at all, especially looking at 2021. There were a lot of field plans, and with COVID and other factors, some of them didn't happen. And so I validated whether or not field plans were carried out. And then so incorporating with Elvis, ABoVE has 38 missions logged in the planning tool currently that have vegetation data archived. And so this is displaying those 38 missions. All of the points in this polygon here are all from the planning tool, and then underlying it, the blue and red lines are Elvis. So 38 missions, 103 events, and as you can see, there's a robust overlap between the field campaigns and the Elvis Airborne campaign. Field missions were successfully flown over by Elvis, as well as the Elvis flight lines in years since were successfully supported by subsequent field missions. And this sort of brings me to my conclusion, which is that from the field to the sky to space, ABoVE has successfully planned its missions to integrate varied data sources, providing diverse observation of the above domain so that this campaign can produce the best science possible. Thank you, and I'll take questions if anyone has any.
Hi, Michael. Thanks so much for that talk. Michael's been working really hard getting all of this together. We're working on writing up information about our Elvis campaign, and so Michael was kind of taking a lot of that information and trying to better understand all of it and see where we overlapped with ISAT and then also getting the sites and measurements information in. So really appreciate all of the work you've done on it, Michael. And these internships are very short. We only have 10 weeks and there's a lot to do to just get people onboarded. And then we're actually presenting to you. We still have a week and a half left in our internship. So it's really, this represents only 8.5 weeks of work. And I think you've done an incredible amount of work in that time. So does anybody have any questions for Michael?
I'll go if that's all right.
Yeah.
So this is Hank. Thanks for the nice presentation. How much of your time was spent working from home in your home office versus getting out to Goddard? And have you, or other places? And did you actually lay eyes on Elvis? Did you see the airplane or anything of that nature?
So for the first part, I would say maybe about 4-to-1 remote versus in person. So I would spend about a day each week in person at Goddard because like I said, I go to University of Maryland, so I'm pretty local. And I did not get a chance to look at Elvis, but I still have a week and a half left, so maybe I can pull some strings. I would definitely like to.
But he did get to come in, and Peter and I gave him a tour of the clean room, and he got to see where James Webb Space Telescope was made, and where they're working on the Roman Space Telescope. And so he did get
And
to tour some of
pace.
the NASA facilities and PACE. Yeah, so he did get to tour some things.
It was very cool. It was an awesome tour.
Did you talk to the folks that process the Elvis data or any members of the Elvis team or?
So I talked to Paul Montesano about ISAT, and then with Elvis, I was mainly just using the flight lines to create the visualizations I made here. So no.
Yeah, we mostly talked with Paul Montesano for this particular project because Paul had some processed Elvis data already that we were able to use.
And then do you have an opinion of which data products are the most popular? Elvis data products are the most popular with the projects?
Um, which ones are the most popular?
Or
I
most
would
sought
say,
after?
yeah, I would just say that in terms of like spatially, um, like I like I said earlier, we see like the most dense Elvis observation around Fairbanks, so in central Alaska, and then also in the Northwest Territories is where we have like the highest abundance of Elvis data. So that would be my answer.
I think the gridded Elvis product that we used from Paul Montesano that he's archived at the DAC is probably the easiest one for teams to use. And I've been encouraging teams to use that particular product because it's in a format that's easier to use and easier to download. So that's the one I tell teams to use most often.
Right,
For
and
follow-up.
that's where
So,
my I'm sorry.
no, go
That's
ahead.
where all of my area calculations came from, because that gridded data also doesn't include where we have poor data quality from Elvis. And so if I just wanted to use the flight lines and then create a buffer with the swaths, it would be actually even more area imaged than the numbers I was presenting. But I was presenting taking out all of the poor data quality. And so yeah, the gridded Elvis data was the most useful to me.
So what can Elvis tell us about tundra? Well, I mean, it's a vegetation structure thing, instrument. You think it'd be really interesting in redwoods and large forests and all that. Why take data over tundra?
Well, it senses ground elevation as well, and so looking at changes over time, looking at permafrost subsidence, I think that Elvis has uses beyond just canopy height and vegetation. I think that especially validating with other data sets that are looking at a larger temporal scale is where probably Elvis would do best with tundra.
Michael, you might not have been able to get into this in this short period of time, but the Elvis data and Tundra sites were also used to help constrain the actual ground location for the SAR flights. Because the SAR the radar doesn't actually pick up exactly where the ground is all that well.
Right.
Um,
Yeah. So yeah, in conjunction with other data sets, I feel like there's definitely uses outside of vegetation and within tundra.
I have a question.
Yeah, Scott's got a question there.
Yeah, I had my hand up there, but so all the statistics you gave on sort of the flight lines and the square kilometers, were they based on quality screen data? So those are, clear cloud-free acquisitions. Is that correct?
Yes. So the gridded data that I was using was based off of where we had the highest quality of Elvis data, and so not every flight line was included in that. And so all of the area measures given were taken from high quality data. So taking into consideration clouds, etc.
Okay, that's what I thought. Yeah, that's really nice. It's a very nice summary. I wonder if somehow this information or this presentation or summary could somehow be used to augment the documentation of the data that Paul has archived at the,
Well,
at the
this
doc.
is going to go into that kind of overview Elvis paper that I'm working on now, and so that was kind of the impetus for having Michael do it this summer, was that then I could put it into the Elvis paper. That's just kind of a corollary to the SAR paper that Chip just got out.
Okay,
Yes.
that's awesome. That's great.
Yeah.
And then another quick question, if there's time, was just, do you have a sense or did you calculate how many of the flight lines overlapped between 2017 and 2019 for change sort of analysis, if anybody wanted to do that? Or has done that?
I didn't calculate the number of intersections between 2017 and 2019, but in terms of including it in Liz's manuscript for the Elvis companion paper, I'll do that. But I didn't
that's a
have
good one.
for this presentation, but that is a great idea. And so with a week and a half left, that'll be one of my closing items.
Awesome. Okay, thank you. Yeah, it was a really nice presentation.
Thank you guys. I really appreciate it. And that's my contact information.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Michael. And I don't see any other questions, so I think we will go ahead and.
Hey Liz, just one other thing
yeah.
to put on your list, and maybe if depending on who's around, we should be able to get somebody from the Elvis team to show him through the Elvis lab.
Yeah, that's a good idea. We'll try to work that out. Yeah, before you finish up.
I think Megan had her hand raised as well, maybe.
Oh yeah.
First time.
Go ahead, Megan.
Oh, sorry, I was clapping. Good job.
Oh,
Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you all for listening.
all right. Thanks so much, Michael. And now we'll send it over to Miles. You can go ahead and introduce yourself and take it away.
Sounds great. Thank you. Let's see here. Cool. Can everybody see this title card?
Yeah, we see your presentation.
Awesome. Cool. Well, hello. My name is Miles. I am a remote intern, interning with Liz this summer. I am a senior undergraduate at the University of Colorado in Boulder, where I study ecology, and I work for the Institute of Arctic and Alpine Research here on campus. My research interests primarily, I'm studying with Dr. Sarah Elmendorf at the Institute, and we work on alpine tundra vegetation phenology across the southern Rocky Mountains. And today I will be talking about my internship project. I've titled it From Field to Air, Integrating Field Data in Support of the ABoVE Airborne Campaign. I wanted to thank Liz, as well as those who supported this internship, including Peter, Dr. Kevin Schaefer, Laura Borgio Chavez, and Libby Larson. And I wanted to thank you all for your time and attention today. I just wanted to start this presentation off introducing, or probably rather reminding you all of the sort of NASA leaf to orbit framework that's depicted here in the scaling diagram. Essentially, the idea is that fantastic science and great geospatial data products can be made by synthesizing data across multiple scales. And remotely sensed data, like those from satellites and aircraft, are often sort of moderately uncertain, and therefore it's extremely important to combine remotely sensed data with field data, such as flux towers and other loggers, as well as local community knowledge. And by combining point-in-time field data with these nearby flux towers or loggers, as is pictured here, with both air and orbit remotely sensed data, we can ground truth these higher level data products and use them with a higher degree of confidence. And so a little background before we get exactly into what I was doing. The ABoVE campaign has both a field and an airborne component. And since 2017, field scientists have gone out into carefully selected field sites and collected soil moisture and permafrost depth, or active layer thickness. These sites are chosen to be coincident in space and often in time with UAVSAR flights. UAVSAR is this aircraft pictured here in the top photo, and the instrument that is collecting the data is on the bottom of the aircraft there. So as many of you know, it emits energy that penetrates the soil, and then its backscatter data can be used to infer soil properties like the depth to the permafrost table and even the moisture of the soil that the energy traveled through. And these two photos here on the bottom are photos from the ABoVE field sampling protocol. Here we have Dr. Kevin Schaefer and somebody else who I can't quite figure out who that is, but they're taking active layer thickness measurements of these probes. This is definitely the most common way to collect permafrost depth in the field. And then here we have a photo of a scientist taking soil moisture at various predetermined depths. And so the ABoVE campaign is now in its synthesis phase. So, lots of scientists have collected a lot of this data. And my goal this summer has been to collect the most recent field data and compile it into a single database that can be published with other ABoVE data on the Oak Ridge National Laboratories Data Archive Center. Fortunately, some of this work had already been done by Dr. Kevin Schaefer back in 2021, and his current first version of the soil moisture and active layer thickness, abbreviated SMALT dataset, mostly contained data through 2020, including ground penetrating radar derived soil moisture and active layer thickness, as well as some probed measurements. I set out this summer to update this database to include all ABoVE data through the most recent 2022 efforts, as well as any data that were collected earlier than 2020, but that were missed in the first version of the SMALT dataset. And next, I aim to use this updated field database in conjunction with processed UAVSAR data from Chen et al. 2022, which I'll introduce you all to later, in order to build ground validation models of the remotely sensed soil moisture and active layer thickness data. So cool, how did I accomplish any of this? What did that look like? Well, first we compiled a list of scientists that we expected to have collected SMALT data within the UAVSAR flight paths in 2021 and 2022, and we began soliciting for data submissions. Once we received data, we QA/QC'd it in Python and Jupyter Lab. We iterated with scientists as needed and reformatted each data set to match the current format of the SMALT data by Schaefer et al. 2021. And after all this was done, I began writing up abstracts, generating metadata, and as well as working on the ground validation models. And here's a really cool photo of some field scientists that I pulled from the NASA ABoVE Flickr library. All right, so what did we get done? Well, I think we got a lot done. 15 field scientists emailed us back. And in addition to the 3,400 active layer thickness and almost 5,000 soil moisture data points that were collected in 2022, which we set out to include in this database, We also reached out to affiliated researchers and partner projects with similar data in the above domain and acquired thousands more data points to include in the small database. These data include data from 2017, as well as even much earlier, quote, pre-ABoVE data. All of this amounts to a significant expansion of the small data set that we hope will enable great science in the above domain and support the use of these remotely sensed products. So in total, this second version of the data set contains more than 221,000 active layer thickness measurements and 29,000, almost 29,000 soil moisture measurements. Over these next couple of slides, I'll have a few more graphs that I hope will orient you to the data set and what has changed. But here you can see the distribution of permafrost depth. I noticed that it's about Gaussian, and it has a mean a little over 50. The soil moisture is more bimodal, which is what I would expect with data sites that span some drier soils and some wetter soils. So here I'm showing active layer thickness measurements across the years. So on the y-axis, we have the number of observations, and the x-axis includes time. And the bars are colored. So the lighter yellow bars are new data that is added to the data set, and the darker purple bars are data that existed in the first version. It's important to point out that many of the data in the first version were generated by pulling a ground penetrating radar along field sites, and that generates a lot of semi-continuous data in a relatively narrow spatial temporal window. So for visualization's sake, I removed those ground penetrating radar points. There's hundreds of thousands of them. But in this plot, you can see that in 2022, we added a significant number of observations. But there's also been a significant expansion in the data from earlier years and an extension in the temporal range of this data set back to 2005. And this is really a result of our efforts to reach out to affiliated scientists and partner projects that may not have been directly linked with the NASA project, but that were in the above study domain and were generous enough to have their data included here. And likewise, here I'm showing the same figure, but this time soil moisture measurements. So, not considering ground penetrating radar data, if we add up all of the new observations from both soil moisture and volumetric water content, the new data that we've included in this second version represents 49% of the entire database. A couple more of these figures. This time I'm showing the contributions broken down by team. And you can see in the inset what these plots would have looked like had I left the ground penetrating radar data in. So I've removed them again to better visualize the contributions of the science teams who collected field data, as well as those who generously offered their time and data to be included here. And likewise, this is a plot of the soil moisture contributions broken down the same way. Note the significant contributions from NGEE and the Scotty Creek research stations. Their data has greatly expanded this data set. And, these graphs are cool and all, but I think what's really great about this data set is just how much space it covers. It covers almost all of Alaska and a significant portion of the Northwestern Territories in Canada. And this data reached not only across the core study region, but also into the extended above domain. So here the green points represent data points that existed in the first version of the data set. And the orange triangles, these lighter triangles here, these represent sites, latitude, longitudes that were completely new to the data set. So some of them are fairly close to others. Some of them are entirely new sites, like we'll see here. And then the purple triangles are latitude, longitudes that existed previously, but that we have extended the temporal range so that, there's more data at the same location through time than there is in the first data set. And so to sort of circle back to the leaf to orbit framework that I made you look at again, NASA is uniquely positioned to implement this sort of framework. And so here I'm showing you a screenshot from the Jet Propulsion Laboratory's UAVSAR website. And in it, you can see where all of the repeat flight paths have been across the ABoVE domain. And this doesn't look all that different from the last map I showed you. And as many of you in this room know, that's probably not an accident. And so we can use this field data to ground truth remotely sensed active layer thickness data. Raw synthetic aperture radar backscatter data is complicated to process and handle, but lucky for me, Chen et al. 2022 has a data set posted on the Orno DAC. You can find that at this DOI down here. They called it the Remotely Sensed Active Layer Thickness Database, or RESALT. And in it, these scientists process the radar using both L and P band backscatter to derive maps of active layer thickness and water table depth. And using ground data, they were also able to produce some soil moisture and seasonal ground subsidence maps. All of these swaths are from 2017, and you may remember from the sort of by year histograms that we have a lot of 2017 data. And so I've been using some of this data to validate these swaths, and I'll show you one of them here. This is really the next step in my internship. What I hope to accomplish over the last week and a half here is to ground truth a lot of these swaths. So, I've acquired the field data, we've constructed the database for the most part, and we're working on generating the metadata, but here we are in the ground validation efforts. And so in this figure, you can see we are looking at the swath over Denali National Park in Alaska. And Matt McCander submitted some data around 8 Mile Lake, and that's represented by these red place marks here. And the UAVSAR, the RESALT processed radar data is a little gappy. And so one thing that I've done to try to maximize our ground truthing efforts is to fill in some of those gaps for my validation models. And so I interpolated the rasters using inverse distance weighting, which is an algorithm that basically guesses the value of an empty pixel using a sort of weighted mean of nearby pixels. And then I extracted those values into a data table so that I could model them against field data. And this is the Denali swath data ground truth against the 8 Mile Lake. Yeah, there were 400 data points for Matt McCander's team, but a lot of them were clustered in the same pixel. So there's definitely not 400 data points here in this graph. But this is just sort of a rough look at what I'm working on now as far as ground validation goes. It's definitely still a work in progress. And I hope that by the end of my internship, I'll have a figure like this, but with a lot more data from many different swaths from the RESALT data. And finally, looking ahead, Liz and I will be reaching out to field scientists who were generous enough to send their data, and we'll be posting the SMALT database to the Oak Ridge National Laboratory's data archive, and we want to make sure that we update the author list so that everyone who contributed data is authored on the publication. We'll also continue the ground validation efforts, generate metadata, and I really would like my workflow to be reproducible and clean so that other scientists don't have to email me to use this data and figure out what I did to it. And yeah, we'd also like to incorporate some logger data. So for instance, Laura Borjo Chavez, her and her team have some logger data that we think would represent really high quality ground validation points. So yes, I also wanted to thank my amazing wife and my parents and sister for being so awesome, and my mentor Liz and everybody else that I mentioned here. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions if you have any.
Thanks so much, Miles. I just think both Michael and Miles have put in so much effort in such a short amount of time to reach out to investigators and to get these data sets together. And it takes a lot of time, and they've really worked hard this summer. So I really want to say I really appreciate all the hard work that you both have done. Do we have any questions for Miles?
Well, I'll go.
Sure.
So how well do you understand let me start generally. How well do you understand the measurements and the algorithms? So more specifically, can you tell us how to measure ALT and how to measure soil moisture and how the resalt algorithm works and that kind of stuff?
Sure, yeah, great question. I have done a few trainings from NASA's Applied Remote Sensing program that sort of teaches you all the nitty-gritty of how synthetic aperture radar works. And that's been really exciting, and it's definitely helped me better understand it. I wouldn't say that I could maybe go and use this sort of algorithm in a publication confidently, but I hope that this internship will have empowered me to learn more about it. I can definitely give you sort of a general overview. I know that because you're using L-band and P-band data that sort of have different depths and are taken different times, the resalt algorithm used that in conjunction with ground data to produce ground subsidence. I also know that active layer thickness is derived from backscatter ratios in synthetic aperture radar data. But I do not know the nitty-gritty of the math involved, although I have read the papers more than once.
But how about the field measurements? Can you measure soil moisture? How would you do that?
Oh, yes, sir. Yeah. This field sampling protocol with ABoVE is actually really similar to work that I've done on Niwot Ridge here in Colorado. Yeah, they're largely taken with these HydroSense sort of handheld soil probes, and they're taken at different measurements, different depths, and then they need to be calibrated based on sort of lab tests that are done using information about the soil type and the probe model that you're using. I don't know, does that answer your question or?
Yeah, generally. I mean, what I was getting at, just as an example, when I started forestry school, there was a bunch of kids from the suburbs and some rural and all that, and they made everybody get out with chainsaw and cut down a tree so that you understand how the basic measurement, or in this case, forestry type stuff, is done. So I just wanted to be probe, and you actually go out after all this and actually measure soil moisture, or is it still a black box to you?
Yes, sir. Yeah, I think that's really important. And, unfortunately, I don't have a lot of experience in the Arctic tundra, but I do have a lot of experience in the Alpine tundra, and it's a relatively similar region. We have permafrost here in Colorado. So, I've taken a lot of these same measurements, fortunately. I don't know that I could cut down a tree, though. Not with a chainsaw. Yes, yeah, somebody said in the chat, chainsaws, what could possibly go wrong?
Yeah. Well, I guess in this particular case, I'd be more concerned about whether you had to go more measure soil moisture. You're aware of what the techniques are, what the pros and cons of the various techniques are, that kind of thing.
Yes, sir. Yeah, I agree. That's extremely important, especially when working with this data. It's great to know exactly how it's collected and what are sort of the quirks about how the data can come out.
And we're trying to make sure that those nuances are reflected in the database that we're putting together. So we're making sure we are clear with investigators on what they're providing to us, whether it's calibrated data or uncalibrated data, so that we get something in the database that's consistent across all the different investigators.
Yeah, because field measurements of organic soils are pretty challenging. And a lot of them are developed for mineral soils.
Thanks for all those thought-provoking questions, Hank. Do you have any other questions for Miles?
Miles, I'm curious. We're hoping to fly the L-band SAR again in 2024. And I've spent a lot of time through the past years as the cheerleader for the, in large part, very much a voluntary contributory effort for the ground measurements. And I'm wondering if we go through that cycle again in 2024, how we would incorporate another year's worth of the ground observations.
I'm sorry, how do you mean? Like, maybe I don't quite understand.
Like, how do we, how next year, you know,
Mm-hmm.
in September of 2024, is there a workflow that we can update the database with the soil moisture and the thaw depth measurements that are made in 2024?
Yes, yeah, that's a great question. I think what you're getting at is like, how can other people continue to update this with data in the future? And that's really what I'm getting at with metadata generation and making sure my workflow is super reproducible, I suppose. I've made a few functions that should be easy for anybody that knows a little bit of Python to implement, that can map data provided by field scientists into the same format and generate a lot of the same metadata.
This is somewhat related. Is there anything that you've learned from looking at what was submitted this year? A great number of the investigators attempted to follow Laura Burgo Chavez's protocol that has been posted, you know, on the website and distributed. Is there a message that you would like to give to the 2024 ground measurement volunteers about how they take or report their data to make it easier to ingest it?
Yes, yeah. And this sort of goes along with how I was speaking with Hank earlier about how I've taken a lot of soil moisture measurements, never a part of a project as this large. And so I can sort of speak to, based on my experience working with this data and taking field measurements myself, that soil moisture data, not only does it need to be calibrated, but it's sort of noisy, at least in the Rocky Mountains. I can pick up the probe and, you know, within my 5 arms lengths, or even within 6 inches of each other, get pretty wildly different soil moisture measurements. And so I think being really consistent with how the field data is collected is extremely important. I suppose that's sort of intuitive, but I think my experience with this really drove that point home. I think that's true for a lot of environmental science as well, as the data can be sort of noisy. And so trying to minimize biases or error wherever possible is really important.
All right, thanks.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, any final questions for Miles?
I have an
You can get-
observation.
Yeah.
You misspelled Laura's last name.
Oh, I did. Yes, this one's missing a U,
Oh,
right?
yeah, it is.
There you go. And during lesson, be sure your collaborators that their names are spelled correctly.
Yes, I agree. Good catch. Thank you.
Yeah, we've had some conference calls with Laura and Kevin to talk with them about the data set, and they've given us some good pointers, and we hope to kind of fill them in a little bit more and towards the end of the internship too, if we can get a hold of them. But yeah, thanks. Good catch, Hank. All right. Well, I wanted to again say thanks so much to Miles and Michael, and thanks to all of you for calling in and listening to their presentations. Our last intern, Carla, she's going to present later on when her internship finishes. She started a little bit later than they did and isn't quite ready yet. So we thank you again, and we really appreciate all your work this summer and for presenting to all of us. Thanks a lot.
Thank you guys for listening.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Have a good one.
Thanks. Bye-bye.